So if you have a Bible with you here or at home, I invite you to turn to 1 Kings, and we'll be looking at just a couple verses in chapter 17 tonight. If you read our little teaser advertisement over the last couple of weeks, you know that tonight we're going to begin a little biographical study of one of the most intriguing characters in the Old Testament who also appears quite frequently in the New Testament. Elijah is certainly not the only prophet in the Old Testament, aside from the ones we most currently remember because they left us substantial writings like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and the other minor prophets that compose the 12. There's a series of prophets that actually appear in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. There's Ahijah, Shemaiah, Jehu, Micah, and even several others unnamed who appear in the storyline without ever being named. But among all those prophets, Elijah stands out for a number of reasons. There's the showdown with the prophets of Baal that we'll see, calling down for fire from heaven, raising someone from the dead, and of course one of those who never died. And we'll also delve into the New Testament a little bit and look at his link with John the Baptist before the series is done. But to really understand Elijah, we need to begin tonight by placing him firmly in the historical context. So if you don't like history, you can turn your mind off for about 3 or 4 minutes while I set the background a little bit. Between the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, we cover almost 500 years of history. Intriguingly, by the way, in the old Hebrew translations, 1st and 2nd Kings were 3rd and 4th Kings. 1st Samuel was 1st Kings, 2nd Samuel was 2nd Kings, 1st Kings was 3rd Kings, and 2nd Kings with 4th Kings. So there's 4 books of Kings in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament, but we've got it divided between Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And for those of us who are historians at heart, 1st and 2nd Kings are a great read for a couple of reasons. They're very affirming, in part because it's the first time in the biblical narrative that we really start getting outside confirmation of the biblical narrative. Until we get to the monarchy, until we get to King David and King Solomon and some of the other kings after him, most of the surrounding nations really don't care one bit about what's happening in this country, this little speck of dust in the middle of the desert stuck on the side of the Mediterranean Sea. And so Israel really doesn't appear in other historical records. It really doesn't appear in other archaeological mentions very much until we get to mentions of David and Solomon and some of the kings after them, and then eventually the exile. So one of the things that we'll find neat as we go, and I'll mention this at a couple points as we go through the story of Elijah, there are moments where we get some confirmation from external sources outside from the Bible. And actually we'll get the first case of that tonight. We've got the drought that lasts 3.5 years while the rain holds out, and weather being what it is, you can't have a weather pattern that affects just the country of Israel and doesn't overlap next door. And so in fact, there's a couple of other neighboring countries that record a 3.5 years drought, 3.5 years when there was no rain in the area, and some of the perimeter countries and some of their histories mention that they experienced the same thing. So Elijah's prayer was that powerful and not only kept the rain from Israel, but even kept the rain from some of the surrounding territories. But back to Elijah. We're going to read just 7 short verses tonight, and they're the first time that Elijah appears on the biblical text. And it happens at an unusual point. When the glorious reign of King Solomon came to an end, we discover that there was trouble brewing just below the surface. There's a mention during Solomon's reign that gold in Jerusalem was as common as the stones on the street. And then when Solomon dies, we realize why that was the case. The people say Solomon taxed us to death. And that's where all the gold came from in Jerusalem, because he taxed people so badly. And so they ask for reprieve, and there is a civil war. And the country is divided into 2 parts. There's 2 tribes to the south, the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, cluttered around Jerusalem, that remain with the descendants, the son and grandson of Solomon, and the northern tribes pull away, and they have a series of kings that murder each other and kill each other and commit adultery and do all kinds of ungodly things, and the country goes quickly downhill. And in fact, those northern tribes will get exiled over 200 years before the tribes of Judah gets exiled, because there's just that much more idolatry and immorality going on. Shortly after the country is divided, the kings of the 10 northern tribes realize that they have a problem. The temple is in Jerusalem, and all the people from their northern tribes keep traveling to the southern tribes to go worship in Jerusalem, and they're losing their people who think it's better to stay with the southern tribes because the economy is better, because God is there, because the temple is there. And so the kings of the northern tribes try and relieve that by creating their own worship centers. Now, at first, it's sort of got a veneer of God. They're worshiping the God who led them out of Egypt. They're trying to keep worshiping Jehovah, the God of Israel. But very quickly it falls into idolatry. And so while the southern tribes of Judah are ruled by a mix of good and bad kings, the northern tribes actually never ever have a good king. All the kings of the northern tribes, without exception, fall into idolatry and immorality, and things go from bad to worse. Elijah is sent to those northern tribes, and he enters the scene during the reign of a man called King Ahab, who with his wife Jezebel have what is one of the worst periods of idolatry and immorality in the northern kingdom. Just want to set the stage for you by reading just the tail end of 1 Kings 16. This comes just before our text tonight. This is 1 Kings 16, verses 29 to 34. In the 38th year of King Asa of Judah, so that's the king who's reigning in the two southern tribes, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. That's the name for the 10 northern tribes. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And that's saying something, because it was pretty bad before he got there. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, kings who came before him, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, and Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son Zegub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. Now, as the story develops, we'll get more details about the awful reign of Ahab, but the tail end of 1 Kings 16 sets the stage by telling us just 3 or 4 things that help us to assess just how bad things were. First, Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all the kings before him. If we had time tonight, I could take an extra hour or so and walk you through some of the despicable things these kings did, but just enough to tell you that Ahab just was over the top. If you thought the book of Revelation was scary, some of the things those kings did come pretty close to the bad stuff we've got in the book of Revelation. So with each successive generation, the immorality and the idolatry just continues to deepen until we hit Ahab. And then the text says as if that wasn't bad enough, Ahab adds 2 things to the sins of all those before him. First of all, he marries a foreign princess. But not just any foreign princess. She's the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians. And as his name suggests, he was front and center in the worship of Baal. His name means the son of Baal. And his daughter didn't fall far from the tree. Just hearing her name sends our ears ringing, because the name Jezebel has come down in history as a horrible woman. So bad, in fact, that her name was used in Revelation as the label for a sinful, idolatrous, lustful woman. And as was to be expected with those kinds of connection, when the king's father-in-law is the son of Baal, the head worshiper of Baal, and he marries his daughter, it isn't long before King Ahab begins to promote Baal worship throughout his kingdom, even building sites of worship throughout Samaria. And then chapter 16 ends with 2 statements that should really make you shudder. First, the text says, and this is stark, the text says that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Now, we've just spent about a year and a half going through the course of God's wrath and anger and righteous judgment in the book of Revelation, and we understand something of the wrath and the anger of God. And we read that when somebody did more than anybody before him to provoke God to anger, we should already be trembling in our boots. And then just to add a little color, just to give us an indication of just how bad things had gotten during Ahab's reign, the text gives us just one more example. When Joshua led the people into the promised land, their very first conquest was the walled city of Jericho. And we considered that event together when we looked at the story of Joshua. And for several reasons, that total destruction of Jericho was very symbolic for God's people. It was their first great victory. It was kind of a first fruits of their victory when they started the conquest of the pagan land. but also because the city of Jericho and its people and the immediate surrounding area were so steeped in idolatry and immorality, God not only ordered that the city be destroyed, but that all living things within it should perish, and he also pronounced a curse on whoever would ever dare to try to rebuild the city. And through Joshua, God said, whoever rebuilds the city, he'll pay for it with the death of his firstborn and his youngest son. And the curse included that promise that is fulfilled in Hale, who had this great idea to rebuild Jericho. And the bad thing isn't just that he rebuilt the city of Jericho. The bad thing is they knew about the curse. They knew that God had promised this curse, and they said, well, who can trust it? It's just God. After all, it's a curse pronounced long ago by God that we no longer worship. Who cares? Ahab's reign was so steeped in idolatry and so completely contemptuous of the true God of Israel that somebody under his reign actually rebuilds Jericho and pays the price for the hubris. I'm not sure how much more clearly the text could tell us that things were as bad under the reign of King Ahab as they could get. It was the low point in the story of Israel. And it's at this point, precisely, that Elijah begins his ministry. Uncommissioned, unannounced, and from total obscurity. 1 Kings 17 and just verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. There's an observation that's frequently made about the great men of history. One historian actually did a study of this, and he noted how frequently great men seem to naturally surface at times of great adversity and challenge. And he goes through a number of illustrations from history. And one of my favorite is his discussion about Winston Churchill, who piloted England and to a certain extent much of the free world during the particularly difficult days of World War II. And the historian's question was essentially whether there would have been as great a man as Winston Churchill without World War II. You understand the question. Obviously, he still would have existed if World War II hadn't happened. But we'd have been the great man with the fame and reputation, with all that he did, unless there'd been this great traumatic event to which he rose to the challenge. And the historian does something interesting. He answers by looking at Churchill's upbringing, and he looks at all the things that prepared him for the great task, including several decades in politics and his exemplary military service. And this evening, as Elijah is thrust into the action at this horrible low point of King Ahab's reign, we wonder what's happened to him in the past to prepare him for this terrible day and to make him the ideal man that the Lord sends in to respond to this terrible calamity of the reign of Ahab. Well, we note first that he's essentially unknown. He's from a town apparently so small that it's never mentioned anywhere else. It's not in the biblical text anywhere else but here in relation to Elijah. Starting in the Byzantine period, 7 or 8 centuries ago, there were efforts by archaeologists to link Tishbe with one or two of the sites that was found, we think, in about the right location. We think we may have found the site, but we're not sure. We have 2 or 3 good guesses. But clearly, Elijah's not from a large, well-known city. He's not from Jerusalem or somewhere like that. And he's not from a well-connected family. We're not even told who his father was. There's several of the prophets whose lineage were given because they were connected to the tribe of Aaron, to the tribe of Levi. They were descendants of David. Elijah has none of that. He's an unknown nobody from a small town nobody's heard of, that we can't even find on a map. And the other unusual thing is that while all of the other prophets have some moment of commissioning or some moment when God calls them before they start their ministry, Elijah doesn't. He hasn't had this moment in the temple like Elijah. He hasn't had a burning bush moment like Moses. He hasn't had a moment like little Samuel in the temple when God calls his name in the middle of the night. There's none of that for Elijah. We are intrigued by his name a little bit. You recognize the L in his name. Whenever you see L in the name, its connection is Elohim, and it speaks of God. So in my name, there's Joel. There's Jehovah and Elohim. Joel means the Lord is God. But Elijah's name is particularly appropriate for a prophet at this time in the history of Israel. Elijah means Jehovah is my God. Interesting statement. Baal and Asherah, his consort, might be the gods you serve, Ahab, but Jehovah, the God of Israel, is my God. He's the one I serve, and he's the one before whom I stand. Now, a couple commentators think the name is just too appropriate to the situation, and they think that Elijah might be a pen name. Could have been a nickname or a pen name that the prophet chose for himself just to make a point as he appears. But however he got the name, it certainly makes a statement, as does his opening line when he comes to King Ahab for the first time. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand. Listen, King Ahab, the bold Elijah says, I don't know who you're taking orders from, but I stand before the God, the Lord, the God of Israel. The Lord is my God, not Baal. In having established his authority and his connection, Elijah makes this very bold pronouncement, there will be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. Now, you got to understand how dramatic a threat this is in this very arid part of the world. In places like the land of Egypt along the Nile River Delta, or in the Amazon River Basin in South America, or even along the estuary of the great St. Lawrence River here in North America, fertility and land production and crops and harvest and whether or not you eat, they always depend on a river. But in arid areas like Israel, where there's not a main river watering everything, and in the surrounding neighboring territories, your crops and your existence do not depend on a river. They depend on the rain and on the dew. If there is no rain and there is no dew, you starve. It's also important to get a little sense of the timing here as Elijah comes. We'll see this a little later in the text, but when we do the math, we'll discover that the whole of the drought will last 3.5 years from start to finish without rain. But the moment when Elijah speaks to Ahab today, there's 3 more years to come. So if you do the math, Elijah prayed a total of 3.5 years for drought. He comes to Ahab 6 months into the drought, 3 more years to go. By the time he comes to Ahab this evening, Elijah has already been praying for 6 months that God would hold the rain. We'll consider later in our series the text from James 5:17, and James says this, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Apparently, Elijah is not predicting a drought that's going to come. Elijah is taking credit for the drought that's already started. Ahab, I want you to know why there hasn't been rain for 6 months and why there won't be rain for another 3 years. It's because of my prayer. Now, why would Elijah do this? What could possibly possess some unknown man in a little town off the beaten path with no record and no connection to suddenly start praying that the rain would stop? Now, in verse 2, which we'll see in a minute, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah, but the word of the Lord doesn't come to Elijah until verse 2. God hasn't spoken directly to him yet. According to other texts, while other prophets only spoke to the king or to those authority after God had spoken to them, it seems that Elijah has taken the first initiative. And there's a reason why he did that, because Elijah knew the scriptures. And Elijah trusted the word of God that he already had. And listen to what God said to his people. This is from Deuteronomy 11, verses 16 and 17. This is from that moment where Moses is giving the law to the people the second time and giving them the warnings and the threats and the promises. And listen to what God says to his people through Moses. Deuteronomy 11, verse 16 and 17. Take care lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving you. Elijah was reading the book of Deuteronomy. Elijah knew from the hand of God, from the mouth of God, that the punishment for idolatry, particularly the punishment for the kind of awful idolatry that was going on under King Ahab and Jezebel, that God's punishment on this was holding back the rain and drought. And so Ahab and Jezebel have crossed the line and angered God and provoked him to an extent that nobody else had dared to do before. And Elijah just can't hold it anymore. He takes the initiative. He goes to see King Ahab, and he speaks those bold words. And it's then that God steps in to use him. And by the way, this is very much in keeping with the way God works. There are times where God seems to have to take an initiative and rouse somebody from sleep and lethargy by appearing in a burning bush or in a vision from the temple or by sending an angel. But there are other moments like this one where Elijah's call from God apparently occurs after Elijah himself responds in holy and sacred wrath for the glory of God, takes matters in his own hands, speaks boldly to the king, and then God steps in. And the threat that he makes is very, very personal. Elijah's opening words to King Ahab are meant to start what we might sometimes call in our parlance a turf war. When God worked, you remember when God works to bring his people out of slavery in Egypt, he wrestles them free from Egyptian control with 10 powerful plagues. And some of those plagues sound really strange to us. There's this infestation of frogs, and the Nile River turns to blood, and we look at these plagues and we go like, what in the world is, like, where did God come up with these plagues? And we discovered that each one of the plagues actually took on one of the Egyptian gods. There was the god of the Nile, and God turns his river to blood, and he says to the god of the Nile, I'm stronger than you. There was a god of the frogs, and God showed that god that he controlled the frogs. There was a god of light, and God sent darkness because he's the one who called the shots in light and darkness. And so the two leading gods that Ahab and Jezebel worshipped were Baal and his female consort, his concubine called Asherah. Baal was a supreme god in ancient Canaan and Phoenicia. Like other countries, there were dozens of gods, all related, but the head god was a guy called Baal. And he was the storm god. He was the storm god who thought he controlled the rain. And usually he was depicted holding a raised lightning bolt. In a couple chapters, we're going to have a showdown on Mount Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And Elijah's basically saying to the prophets of Baal, if your God is the God of thunder and storm and the God of lightning, let's see if he can send down a bolt of lightning to burn the sacrifice you've offered. And Elijah's point's going to be, no, your God doesn't control lightning, my God does. Your God doesn't, my God does. And Asherah, his queen, was the chief female deity. She was the goddess of fertility. She's usually represented by a carved pole or a tree planted in the ground. And God's going to say, you think that Asherah is sending you harvest? She's not. I'm in control of the harvest. So the rain and the dew, which Elijah's praying to stop, are the purvey of Baal and Asherah. Rain and fertility, they're not controlled by Baal and Asherah. They're controlled by the God of Israel. And by his prayers, Elijah's showing these two false gods to be totally powerless. I've got to tell you, I'm kind of impressed and challenged by Elijah. Too often, you and I are far too slow to speak up when the glory of God is trampled and the transgression is obvious. But Elijah, apparently without being prodded by God, without any official commissioning, without being ordained by any church, feels a need to intervene and to say something. We see young David respond the same way. You remember David goes to visit his brothers at the front of the battlefield, and while he's there one day, Goliath comes out and says, hey, send me a champion and we can feed you to the birds of the air. And you remember what David's at? You remember David's question to his brothers? He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And so Elijah has not been commissioned by God, but he says, who does Baal and Asherah think they are? Who do Ahab and Jezebel think they are to lead their people in idolatry to these gods who are no gods? Our God is in control. Now, one thing I've often wondered is how Elijah arranged for this audience with King Ahab. He's not the country's prophet. He's not a Levite. He's not a priest. He's got absolutely no standing. He's an unknown guy from an unknown town. I wonder how the phone call went when he called the secretary of protocol for the king. I'd like an audience with the king. What's it about? Well, I got a couple things I'd like to say to the king. I don't know what that looked like, but however it happens, he finds himself before Ahab, and he doesn't mince his words. As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. I wish God would give us that kind of boldness sometimes. Now, God's got a problem. That bold, courageous first step begins Elijah's life as a prophet. But God knows now that unless he intervenes to save Elijah, there will not be a second step in Elijah's prophetic ministry. Having spoken this boldly to this evil a king, Elijah is now in mortal danger. And God does something that we don't expect. We kind of expect God to say, wow, great to go, Elijah. Okay, here's the next thing you're going to do. You're going to show down with the prophet. And God says, no, run away. Run away to safety. And it's not because God isn't powerful enough to protect Elijah, or because God is not powerful enough for the showdown that will inevitably come, because we'll see in a couple chapters, God can run that. He's got it. But it's a little too early for the confrontation. It's a little too early for Ahab. Ahab isn't ready yet. I think that for Ahab, this is a warning. You remember we went our way through the book of Revelation, and God doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, judgment. He goes 1, 2, 3, here's a chance to repent. 4, 5, 6, here's a chance to repent. And 7. So when Elijah comes to Ahab, he tells him about holding back the rain, and he tells him that it's because of the idolatry. Ahab, I think, is given a chance to repent and think things through. And it's also a little too early for Elijah. Elijah needs some preparation. 3.5 years without rain will harden Ahab and Jezebel, but it'll also prepare Elijah for the challenges ahead. So let's read the next portion of our text, just verses 2 to 7 of 1 Kings 17. And the word of the Lord came to him. Finally, God speaking to Elijah directly. But he's telling him something we kind of don't expect. Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I've commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. And he drank from the brook. After a while, the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. We'll deal with verse 7 a little bit later in weeks to come. But in verses 2 to 6, there's a couple of important lessons for us. As much as we might be startled, we need to learn to listen to God when he says that it's time to stand down. I wonder what instructions Elijah was expecting to get next from God. I wonder whether maybe he expected that God would use him courageously for some other great next step in his campaign to rid Israel of idolatry. At one point when God commissioned Gideon, you remember he sends Gideon to start knocking down the idol temples that were maybe Elijah expected something, but that's not what God tells him to do. God's instructions when it was time to back off and wait. I confess that I don't do that well. I'm not good at waiting. Charging is my default position. But sometimes God says it's time to wait. And usually in that time of waiting, God is either preparing us or preparing someone else for the next steps or preparing a circumstance. And that's what God's doing. So in the time of waiting, Elijah's got to hide out. He can't keep doing whatever he was doing for a living. Somehow God's going to take care of him, and God does. And so that's the second lesson for tonight. That during those moments of waiting, the care and the providence of God come through. And it's pretty amazing the way God takes care of Elijah, isn't it? The way he's given bread and meat every day kind of reminds us of the way God took care of his people every day in the desert, except that this is even better. The man in the desert just came once a day, and it was just bread. Elijah gets meat and bread in the morning and every night. I get the feeling Elijah might have put on a little weight. Maybe he needed that for the drought that was coming. I don't know. And there's a reason why God chooses ravens to provide for him. I don't know if you noticed in our hymn tonight by Newton, he picked up on this. Ravens are not birds that naturally share. Ravens are scrappers. They're scavengers. There are a couple of other animals and birds that are communal in their approach to food. There are other bird species that actually share food when they find it. Not ravens. Ravens are thieves. They actually steal food from other ravens. They don't even share with other ravens. So this act, this gesture of kindness from these ravens runs so completely counter to what you would expect from a raven. And that's why God uses ravens to feed them. for months on end, because he wants Elijah to know for certain he's not being fed because accidentally he happens to find a cowing raven. Elijah realizes if these ravens are doing this, God's involved. This is not the ravens out of the goodness of their heart. The Creator and the Sovereign Lord of all that he has made continues to order and direct the created world. He overrules the natural instinct of the ravens at the brook to feed Elijah. He overrules the natural patterns of the rain and the dew for the next 3 years. He will overrule nature to send down lightning strike from heaven that will consume the offered sacrifice on the mountain. And so there's this important lesson that Elijah needs to learn. The worshipers of Baal thought that he was the god of rain and lightning and that his female consort was the goddess of controlled fertility. But God is sovereign over all of those things. When the courageous Elijah started on this process, beginning with his bold presentation to the immoral, idolatrous King Ahab, I'm sure he thought that God had some great lesson to teach that scoundrel of a king. But before Elijah did that, before he was ready to do that, there are a couple of lessons that Elijah himself needed to learn before he taught lessons to Ahab. So when you and I face times of waiting, especially when we get frustrated because we think that there's this important work that needs to be done and we feel like we're on hold, we need to slow down long enough to figure out what important lessons God's trying to teach us first. And inevitably, as God takes us through those times of learning, we see his grace and his kindness firsthand, confirming his sovereignty and his care. So I have 3 prayers tonight. That God would teach us to be bold and courageous, standing with conviction on his word when it's time for confrontation. Second, I pray that God would teach us to be trusting and confident in him when it's time to sit quietly and wait. And above all, that he would teach us to be attentive enough that we can tell when it's time to be bold and when it's time to sit and wait. Because it's hard to tell sometimes, isn't it? May the Lord teach us those 3 lessons. Amen.